Hi everyone. Just going through a few things. So I think I just want to make a quick video because we have this pattern here, which is I have a plugin, an FFI plugin, and then editor plugins. This is for agent docs. So I don't want to repeat a bunch of duplicated logic across all the different plugins for different editors. So I have a JetBrains editor, a VS Code plugin, and then eventually I'm going to have Vim and Zed, and you know um, some of the other editors that are up and coming as well, like Key, and there's a few others, Helix. So I want to make this generalizable FFI plugin, which then we use FFI from the front end. This is the back end, plugin back end, and in the plugin front end, we use, we communicate with the back end over FFI. So Claude is interesting because it has this pattern where it wants to minimize effort. So when I asked it to implement, so right now I'm working on replacing a file-based IPC, inter-process communication, that was pulled from the plugin with a socket-based IPC, and I'm also making it cross-platform. Right now, it'll definitely work with Linux, probably OS X, and Windows is might be shaky, but Windows agent doc with tmux on Windows is still like not very, it's going to require some hoops to jump through to get there. But anyways, I wanted to replace the IPC, the file-based IPC, with a socket on OS X and Linux, and I think name pipes on Windows. So we used the I think it was there was a crate, interprocess crate, and just kind of going through. So anyways, I had it implement the API. It kind of suggested an API for the FFI plugin that. Well, no, actually, sorry. The first thing it did was it just wanted to implement the JetBrains plugin. It was the same plugin, and I have a backend FFI plugin and a front end, XML editors, but I'm dogfooding on JetBrains. So when it says plugin, it's a little ambiguous. So what it did was it decided to minimize effort and create a Kotlin implementation of the sockets. And what I really wanted was okay, this is a JetBrains plugin socket IPC. So what I really wanted was the backend FFI plugin in Rust. But yeah, I should have probably paid more attention to this. But it was saying here's the implementation approach, and anyways, it built it, and then I mentioned, okay, this should be an FFI plugin. We've already added agents. So I already mentioned agents MD to prefer implementing the FFI plugin over individual editors. And I asked it, why did you not follow these instructions? Should we have a private repo skill instead? Well, this is just my private repo. And then so how do we ensure we don't do, we follow the heuristic of implementing the backend FFI plugin? So it said that it did the pure Kotlin listener because it was easier, quote unquote, easier implementation. And basically that seems like it's a heuristic that is just kind of ingrained in the Opus model, perhaps, or maybe something in the claude-code harness. But so we kind of have to override that and not just put it in 8 or Claude MD, but so I have agents MD and it's symlinks to Claude MD. So we need something stronger than just in Claude MD. So I was kind of discussing, okay, well, how do we do that? And basically, it's kind of saying that, yeah, it has some suggestions, which is, so it's saved in feedback memory. So already my session in the memory, it's going to kind of do that. So I maybe I shouldn't have done that because I want to test it out, you know, the actual harness itself. But I'm kind of throwing a bunch of redundancy at it now. So I'm making it stronger by putting it into a skill. And now I want to make this a generalizable pattern with ontology, which is, with existence length. So I think that if we can create a good terminology for this, then maybe we can start to refer to it better. So this is kind of like an approach where we use domain language to codify the pattern, and we'll make it more concrete. A stronger signal or a stronger reference. With the agents. So that's kind of the hope, and it makes sense. It's logical. So, all right, we have a shared foundation pattern. Interesting. So this is what Claude recommends, is we call it a shared foundation, grounded in ontology. The convention now reads FFI first for editor integration, shared foundation pattern. I wonder if we should call it FFI shared foundation pattern, just because it's not scoped at all. I mean, shared foundation could be implicitly scoped, but I feel like we should have an explicit scope. So, all right, when adding features that editors need, sync debounce, busy guards, IPC listeners, layout validation, implement the FFI layer first, then call from editor plugins via JNAFFI. Editor plugins should be thin event reporters. Business logic belongs in the shared FFI library, not duplicated. The ontology is the FFI library is the system internalized whole. Each editor plugin is a perspective, thin adapter. The CABI is the abstraction stable interface. It's interesting. Business logic never lives in a perspective. Test, does this feature need work in more than one editor? Implement an FFI. So I'm not exactly fully digging how it overlaid ontology. I feel like it feels a little forced. So I want to maybe address that as well. Yeah, because the FFI is the system. I mean, really, system could be anything. I don't think Claude quite gets the system, the perspective, the abstraction, because these are universal terms that can apply to any parts of the system. So, including the system itself, and there could be subsystems, and there could be perspectives according to each entity in the subsystem, and the abstraction is basically each symbol, each whether it's a term or some other symbol. So I don't like how it is like almost assigning parts of existence laying into each particular, into different subsections of the system. So I think we should correct this, because I don't want to set a bad precedent here. So we have a fundamental misunderstanding. So maybe I should say you have a fundamental misunderstanding of how existence laying is applied using with an ontology. So the primary concept, or maybe a primary concept, is each term in the schema is applicable in to different entities and scopes. Maybe scopes and entities. So when we say ontology system perspective abstraction are not cannot, are not represent, I guess, are not representative of different parts of the FFI, of the shared foundation pattern. Instead, each of, I'll just throw this out again. Instead, ontology, system, perspective, abstraction are applicable to any scope in any system. I would say are descriptive. Are descriptive of any scope in any system. So instead, ontology, system, perspective, abstraction are descriptive of any scope in any system / entity. I should say. Okay. So I guess I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. To be at least explicit from a language standpoint, from communicating this. So this means, I think it's going to start to get it now. So this means, maybe I should just flesh out the example. Okay, so ontology, FFI library is the system internalized whole. Each editor plugin is a perspective. So each editor plugin, I would say, has a perspective, as does the FFI library, as the FFI library has a perspective. Maybe we should hammer this a little bit more. Ontology, the FFI library is the system. I would say is a system, as is each editor plugin is a system. The CABI has an abstraction, or I guess the CABI is an abstract. Oh, okay. So I guess maybe, okay, it is an abstraction, as each editor plugin is an abstraction. each of their plugins, I guess, interface. So this is the interesting correlation: is the interface the is that the abstraction? And that's an interesting thing. I mean, I would say that the concept as a whole is the abstraction. But we could limit it to the interface being an abstraction. Maybe we should also note that. So note that abstraction is like a symbol of a real entity. I would say is the symbolic representation of a real entity. Okay. So the API or ABI is how other entities interact with the entity, the subject entity. And maybe, but the abstraction itself is a symbolic. I mean, because, okay. I think there's some finer points to this. So the CABI is an abstraction to each editor's plugin and as each editor plugin's interface is an abstraction. Note the abstraction is a symbolic representation of the real entity. So the API ABI is how other entities interact with the subject entity. But yet the concept of abstraction is a symbol is symbolic of, or maybe yet an abstraction is a symbol of something real. I want to say the map is not the territory, meaning the abstraction is not, I would say the abstraction is kind of like a low information form of the real entity. Well, not necessarily. I mean, it could be even more information dense, but it's a symbolic. It depends, because if the symbol itself is more information dense than the actual real entity, then that's not the case. But it's really kind of like a mapping onto an ontology or itself. So it's like this abstraction belongs to an ontology or schema. So the map is not the territory. The abstraction belongs in an ontology, or in a schema, I should say. Let's just say schema. Belongs in the schema. The real entity, the real entity okay, so this is where existence laying is. I gotta like really define this. So this is kind of the guts of existence laying. So the abstraction belongs in the schema. So it's like each symbol is within the schema. that you can kind of pick out, and it has relationships maybe with other abstractions, but the real entity is not in the schema. It's like its own thing. So this is like what being. The real entity is the being. Being outside of the schema. I gotta really consider this. So is it actually outside of the schema, the real entity? Well, if the real entity is the schema itself, then, if the real entity is itself an abstraction, then is the abstraction, then that's entirely something else. But it's like the abstraction is almost like a type. Maybe that's a good way of putting it as well. So there's like a type. Well, no, because in the case of programming, it's like an instance. So, yeah, I might need to table this and really kind of process this a little bit. But the abstraction is, I'll definitely iterate on this. So, maybe this philosophy on the fly is a little, you know, we're obviously iterating. So, all right. So the abstraction is a symbol of something real. The map is not the territory. The abstraction belongs in the schema, or I would say is a member of the schema. Is a member of the schema. The real entity is, and I would say the abstraction points to, I would say the abstraction is, a member of the schema, a symbol of the real entity. I'm not going to really throw anything else in there. So please, I think that's good. So we can use vagueness as almost like a placeholder too. So I don't know if you noticed that I was trying to be very specific and I was like fumbling around with contradictions. But if you kind of zoom out a bit and become a little bit more vague, then the contradictions kind of just go away and you're kind of talking about something a little bit more vague and fuzzy. And that's okay. Vagueness is, you don't have to be specific about everything, like super specific about everything, especially if you start running into contradictions. That's where like you have inaccuracy. This is where you have precision and accuracy. I feel like it's great to be accurate. You don't have to be precise. And I feel like a lot of people want to be precise at the cost of accuracy. And I think that it's better to, vagueness has a great place because within the vagueness there is a lot of room to play, and there's also the ability to refine things and to explore systems within that vagueness. And it's basically like it is semi-constrained. It's maybe not as like specifically constrained as maybe somebody might feel comfortable with, but if you're comfortable with the vagueness, then it's completely encapsulating the possibility space of this concept that we're exploring. So it's like it sets the boundaries right, and it might be like a little bit too wide, but that's okay because as you iterate, you can refine further and further and kind of maintain accuracy as you're doing this further refinement of selectively narrowing scope and maybe tightening the boundaries of what this thing means that we're exploring, this entity. So yeah, so notice that I add some vagueness here, and now the contradiction went away. The map is not the territory. The abstraction is a member of the schema, a symbol of the real entity. All right, so please update the core. I would say if so, because there was a misunderstanding or a misapplication of existence lang, because there was a misapplication, it seems that existence lang itself needs to be updated. Needs to be refined. Please add the I would say the amendments, or please amend the ontology of existence lang and any other supporting skill MD or binary software to, I mean, it's probably no binary software, or I would say skill MD and or binary software to support these amendments to ensure proper application, to ensure existence lang is correctly applied to a domain. Okay. So this stuff I think we're gonna ignore because it's kind of already on the wrong premise. Well, the generalization text. Does this feature need to work in more than one perspective? Implement the system exposed via abstraction. Okay. So I think it's like really trying to create something concrete here. And maybe we need a new term. So I would say it seems that abstraction is used in a concrete sense here. Well, seems that we can have another term, to maybe to disambiguate abstraction, or another term to allow abstraction. We can use another term instead of abstraction to allow abstraction to retain its core properties, or core meaning, its core meaning and application within, when using existence lang. Okay, let's run this a little bit again after the boundary. Looks like we caught Claude before it responded. Oh shoot, I gotta oh yeah, I should just do this. Okay, so now we're bypassing permissions. At some point, yeah, I definitely want to have something more cross-platformed in tmux as well, because obviously Windows, I mean, it could work on Windows, but maybe there's a better library, but there are Tmux implementations on Windows, so it's still relevant right now. It's as good of a cross-platform library as we can get right now, but there might be ways to improve it, to improve, the editor to multiplexer API. Okay, so ontology misapplication of an existence laying refinement. So you're right. All right. Uh-oh. You're right. I fundamentally misapplied existence laying. So again, I want to repeat this. I'm not going to shy away from whenever Claude says you're right, because kind of a quote unquote best practice is to just start over again, because I'm building something that needs to be robust enough to handle different states of the context. So we need to be able to recover from these sort of things. So when the LM starts to act, the agent starts acting squirrely, we still need to work, even if it's not maybe on the ideal path. Or so, because I think that ultimately we are hill climbing. We're finding the peak somewhere, and maybe it's a local maxima, maybe it's a global maxima, or maybe, well, it'd be really hard to find a global maxima, but we're trying to hill climb somewhere and kind of get to the correct sort of application. So, all right, you're right. I fundamentally misapplied existence laying. So I mean, and it is attempting to correct itself. So we'll have to give it that, and it's just a matter of making sure it always corrects itself and quickly enough to where we should just continue rather than start over as well. I misapplied existence laying by assigning terms as exclusive labels for architecture roles. Yes. So thank you for throwing that in there. System is FFI library, perspective, plugin, abstraction, CABI. Every entity in existence is a system, has a perspective, and exposes abstractions. These terms are universal descriptors, not role assignments. Thank you. So I would say update. All right. Okay, so looks like we're doing Claude philosophy. So this is my local Claude philosophy. I would say that these should be skills, perhaps, because we want to be able to replicate this to other installs. So existence should be the existence binary, and skill MD should be installable on other systems. Please apply these changes to skill ND. I would say existence. And maybe should the install process, or should the existence CLI update or agents d/Claude MD on the host system. Okay. Also update. Okay. So Yes, share library is the whole relationship. Yes, the FFI plugin editor plugins. Yes, the each editor is a whole of relationship. Each plugin is a whole of relationships. I'm not really sure. This must be from Existence Lang. I created a philosophy back in 2015 just to kind of sort of structure each domain, each sort of term in the in the ontology, and this might have been what I arrived at, but it's the whole of relationships. So I want to probably figure out if we can, we need some rigor probably. Like, I'm not really a professional philosopher. In fact, I have very little philosophy, traditional philosophy education. I come from a computing background, and I was into domain-driven design, and I was just trying to express these terms. So I think that some rigor is in order, and I want to make this like continuously rigorous. So I originally, I should mention that, created the definitions of these terms back in 2015, 11 years ago. I don't have, I was not philosophically trained, or I was not, I wasn't, I don't know. Maybe I should just say I want to apply rigor, like iterative rigor, to each term in the ontology, each member of the ontology. Yeah, I don't need to mention my history. So we can refine the meanings over time. All right. So it doesn't quite, it's still equating abstraction with API or interface. So you seem to be conflating abstraction with interface. Abstraction, abstraction has a broader meaning. The representation, excuse me, I would say the symbolic representation of the entity, which is more than the API, or more than the interface. All right, so shared foundation pattern is about scope. Place shared logic at the broadest scope so narrower scope systems can access it. That's good. This isn't about which entity is which term. It's about which scope owns the logic. Uh-oh. I need to get rid of this. Note an abstraction. As you pointed out, an abstraction is the symbolic representation of a real entity. The map is not the territory. The CABI is how other entities interact with libagent-doc. But it's a symbol, not the library itself. Same for the JNA declarations as the abstraction of the JetBrains plugin interface. The existence and its binary don't need changes. The application guidance now lives in the philosophy claude-md, where all agents will find it. So I had this whole thing up here, so I think we're gonna update that. Alternative term for abstraction in domain overlays. You're right. Using abstraction as a label for the ABI overloads the term. In existence lang, abstraction means a concept that models something else without its complexity. I would say that is true some of the time, but I don't think this term is, I don't agree with it right now. I think that at this point I don't agree with this term. The abstraction is a symbol in a schema that, or is a symbol in a schema. The abstraction represents, okay, the abstraction is a symbol that represents an entity, or say a real entity, and the abstraction is a member of a schema. I don't know if the let's just say the abstraction is a member of a schema. It's almost like the schema in a lot of ways, because it's really like, you know, each term, you know, each basically in the ontology, there's only one ontology, and so you have all these terms available in language, but we're going to apply scope to it in context. You know, basically we're going to apply context, which includes scope, to the ontology. And this is what, you know, the scope plus the abstraction is what creates the meaning. So the abstraction is a member of the ontology. I mean, maybe the ontology, we should be more specific. So we have the ontology, which is kind of like words, ultimately. I don't like an abstraction can be a picture, like a icon. That can be an abstraction. But would an icon belong in an ontology? I would say I'll just call it a member of the schema. So an abstraction can be a word. So this is where prologue might be useful. Maybe I want to have existence lang be prologue or something. I'm not really sure yet. I'm gonna leave it open for now, but an abstraction can be a word or a or a icon or any other representation of a real entity. So it can be a word, an icon, a speech, a spoken an utterance, or any other representation of a real entity. The defined surface through which one system communicates with another system. The contract, protocol, or interface. Okay, so the existing ontology terms don't fit. Abstraction is too broad. Any simplification of complexity. I would say this. So a concept that models something else without its complexity. So I'm going to say I don't agree with this term. I'm going to say that the abstraction is a symbol that represents a real entity. The abstraction is a member. Okay, so I'm going to move this down. So the phrase, or I'm going to, okay. So this, so it often, an abstraction often is often a simplification of the real entity, but not always. Sometimes the abstraction is just as, if not, or more complicated than the real entity. And I guess an example of this, like a concrete example, is, let's say the real entity is itself an abstraction, and the abstraction to this real entity, which is an abstraction itself, maybe is like commentary or some other mapping that is itself more complicated. So for example, maybe if the real entity is itself is an abstraction is an abstraction, maybe is itself an abstraction in its own schema, the abstraction to the real entity maybe let's call this, if the real entity A maybe I'll call it O, the abstraction to the real entity O, so maybe we'll call this A, or we'll call this E. Okay, so the abstraction to the real entity, so the abstraction A to the real entity O may be more complicated, may have more information than the real entity E. All right. I think this should be clear enough. It's not like super rigorous, but I think we can refine it. And I think it's good just to move on. So the concept that so we have abstraction too broad, communication act as signaling, not the surface itself. Signal the information transmitted, not the contract governing it. And model exemplifies a system, not the interface boundary. Okay, so options for a new domain overlay term. Interface, the defined boundary through which one system's signals are structured for consumption by another system. An interface is a specialized abstraction constrained to a contract. Software native immediately understood. Contract, the agreed upon structure of communication between systems. A contract defines what signals are valid and how they are interpreted. Emphasizes the binding agreement aspect. Okay. Surface, the boundary at which one system meets another. A surface constrains the scope of interactions between systems. More abstract, emphasizes the boundary. And protocol is the rules governing communications between systems. A protocol defines the structure, sequence, and semantics of signals, emphasizes process and rules. Each of these is an abstraction, lowercase philosophically. Okay. But none is abstraction, the ontology term. Okay, uppercase. This lets abstraction retain its core meaning. Which term feels right for this domain overlay? Is there a different term you have in mind? Once we agree, all authoring new ontology. Okay, so all right, so we have interface. I think interface. I mean, these other things are true, but yeah, I mean, it's obviously interface. All right, so I think I actually did talk about interface up here. So, yeah. I guess protocol I would say protocol involves the interface. So protocol involves the interface faces of the systems. I'll throw that little tidbit in there. And I feel like, yeah, if we can get rigor here, this will be really good. And this is where the philosophers are going to really shape how, agentic software can be precise and accurate with the correct amount of vagueness. I think that as long as we can create like a decent framework, and I think that existence lang is decent enough. Perhaps it needs modifications, but it's a good starting point at least. We can then have a way to define the ontologies and systems from philosophy, which then creates sort of a bridge of meaning between spoken words, between humans and agents, and we can have a shared understanding and thus alignment. All right, so the abstraction refinement, interface term and existence CLI. Abstraction definition updated. Before, an abstraction is a concept that models something else, allowing expression without its complexity and ambiguity. After, an abstraction is a symbol that represents a real entity. An abstraction is a member of a schema, a word, an icon, an utterance, or any other representation of the real entity that is an abstraction. An abstraction is often a simplification of the real entity, but not always. When the real entity E is itself an abstraction in its own schema, the abstraction A representing E may carry more information than E itself. Okay. I mean, that's not like the only example, but that's an easy to describe example, so I'll just leave it at that. I don't need to be like super like rigorous or I mean, we should be rigorous, but we don't need to like bury the concept with a bunch of details. Okay. Also updated global Claude MD ontology table and match. Interface note authored. Okay, so we have an interface in philosophy. Okay. I would say this definition belongs in existence source interface MD. Let me see if we already have one. No, we don't. So I'm a little concerned that Claude is kind of not like naturally doing the right things. It's like we don't have alignment here, and we need to sort of create that alignment. And oddly enough, that's kind of what what existence lang is for, is to create the alignment. But in doing this definition, in this dogfooding session, we don't have alignment. So this is a good exercise of that. So, okay, so in interface is the defined boundary through which one system communicates with the excuse me. Interface is the defined boundary through which one system communicates with another system. It constrains the scope of interaction by defining what signals are valid and how they are structured. An interface is an abstraction, a symbolic representation of how a system can be interacted with, but it is a specific kind of abstraction, one that defines a contract between systems. Okay, that's fair enough. All right, so we updated agent.claude and Claude philosophy Claude to use interface instead of abstraction. Okay, good. All right, I'm going to take a little break here, and I'll be back, and we'll continue with our existence CLI installability, which, yeah, we want this. So, all right. Yeah. Till next time, where is OBS? There it is.